So if you're in the parish hall, let's see, does that... Good morning. If you're in the parish hall, please get some coffee and find a seat. And if you're watching from home, we'll get started in about 2 minutes. One, two, one, one. One. Does this mic work a bit better? It does, doesn't it? Yeah. I know you'll be back. Would you prefer to use a lavalier mic? Of course, you don't have a pocket to put it in, do you?
Yeah, I don't.
Okay,
I
that's
guess-
fine.
So I'll need to speak into this and then point.
Yes, and I can help you with that. So
Okay.
let's see. All right, well, back to this mic. Does this sound good? Okay. Welcome. I think that Cynthia Radding is the speaker who has traveled the furthest to be with us. Because you may think that she just lives down the hill, but she actually lives in Mexico. So Cynthia is the Goosenhoven Distinguished Professor Emerita from the University of North Carolina, recently retired, and I am going to get a copy of her new book, Bountiful Deserts, for you to look at. And then I'm going to turn the mic over to Cynthia. Welcome home. And we're so pleased to have you here.
Boyk and I, good morning. Good morning and blessed height. Yeah. Good morning and blessings on all of us on this day of St. Michael. And it's a joy to be here. Thank you so much, Boykin, for arranging this and for welcoming me back to Chapel of the Cross. I still consider this very much my church home, and I'm attending church in Mexico and really enjoying a new life of discovery and relationships and ongoing research projects in Mexico. So this morning I wanted to talk to you about the book that I published actually 2 years ago, Bountiful Deserts, Sustaining Indigenous Worlds in Northern New Spain. And what I want to do is print a little bit about the book and then about the kinds of relationships that I have developed with indigenous communities in Mexico in the course of writing the book and in the years following, and relationships which are continuing. And to talk a little bit about collaborative research, what that means, and how knowledge is produced and passed on from generation to generation, which is the theme of this year at Chapel of the Cross. So my talk is From Generation to Generation, Bountiful Deserts, Collaborative Research for Sustaining Indigenous Worlds through community institutions and traditional ecological knowledge. Research and writing Bountiful Deserts has brought me to a deeper understanding of the geographical and spiritual meanings of space, landscape, and people. The process has led to new discoveries in both unexpected and familiar places. It has shown me how to engage more fully in collaborative research, expanding the boundaries of the academy through the language and memories of current communities that sustain the wisdom of ancestral traditions in changing historical circumstances. The three main themes of Bountiful Deserts, which is in our church library, render the histories of the Yoreme peoples of northwestern Mexico through the enduring relationships between people and the natural environments they shape. Their corridors of migration and geographies of settlement, and the production and dissemination of knowledge. Knowledge flows through experience, focused observation, and ritual ceremonies that are taught from one generation to the next. My presentation will summarize the book's main findings and narrative flow, and in the discussion that will follow, I hope we will explore together the co-creation of knowledge through different media and forms of documentation, and how this creation of knowledge relates to a spiritual relationship with nature and with one another. We gathered in the patio of a village elder in the small village of Los Nachuquis, the place of the Huachapori thorns. Under the shade of mesquite and piocha trees, we discussed the vital link between strengthening the Yoremnoki language among the contemporary Yoreme communities and the defense of what they call Luturia, their rightful claim to the forested spaces of the Monte, the spiritual world of the woodlands that they call Huya Anya, and the resources it provides. Several of the men and women present recalled their ancestors' legacy and the stories they told about the struggles to defend their land, their intersection with Mexican history. They affirmed that territory, what they call Itom Anya, or our world, signifies not only the land, but also the culture and the wisdom of the people. To speak of traditional ecological knowledge and environmental justice in the third decade of the 21st century opens a wide panoply of applications for these terms and their implications for politics, policy, environmental justice, and community identity. The meanings of traditional ecological knowledge extend to nature, understood as a material entity and as a cluster of natural rights, rights that accrue to rivers, to mountains, and to the peoples living with them. Traditional ecological knowledge also extends to justice in the sense of political rights to resources and their equitable distribution, and to community. Community refers to the social collective or the local polity of stakeholders who assert claims to territory and material resources, endowing them with both economic and cultural significance. Communities constitute the essential link to traditional knowledge, and they sustain practices of resilience in the face of climate change and in opposition to powerful interests for the commercialization of nature. Contemporary demands for traditional ecological knowledge and scholarly debates over its different meanings necessarily rest on a historical foundation of lived experiences, social memories, and environmental observations that are safeguarded in the community and transmitted across generations. Local knowledge itself evolves, and these historical pillars of knowledge and accumulated experience bring memories from the past to reflect on the multidimensional significance of environmental justice in our own time. The spatial and cultural creation of Itom Anya. Northwestern Mexico constituted a series of overlapping borderlands, radiating northward from the tropical environments of the Gran Nayar to the arid lands of the Sonoran Desert. What the Spaniards first called the land of reed houses, from the Nahuatl word, Petatlan, became a region defined by 4 major river valleys that flowed through the slopes and canyons to water the coastal plains leading from the Sierra to the Gulf of California. So these overlapping borderlands extend from south to north, from the tropical to arid lands, and also from the east, from the Cordillera of the Great Sierra Madre Occidental, westward and downslope to the coastal plains and then the Gulf of California. Native peoples created cultural landscapes through their labor, knowledge, and ceremonial cycles across different ecological zones, extending eastward from the Gulf of California through coastal beaches and brackish wetlands, networks of streams and floodplains, and the monte of thorn forest, cacti, and hardwood trees. Indigenous peoples defended these territories through their relationship to the life-giving monte, the source for hunting, gathering medicinal plants, fruits, seeds, and building materials, and for its spiritual power. The peoples of these 4 major river basins adapted Mesoamerican cultigens to these semi-arid but watered valleys, developing local varieties of maize, cucurbits, beans, chilies, amaranthus, cotton, and tobacco, as well as root crops like camotes, or what we would call sweet potatoes. Their combined practices of planting, harvesting, and gathering redistributed different species of herbaceous plants, succulents, and cacti. Furthermore, all the indigenous communities of the highlands and the river valleys both cultivated and gathered numerous varieties of edible and fibrous plants. The rivers and coastal mangroves and estuaries provided an abundance of marine life and freshwater fish, as well as salt. Indigenous peoples moved seasonally through different biomes to create a mixed livelihood of farming, foraging, and trade. Their landscapes were not timeless or unchanging, however, and their practices for planting, hunting, and foraging produced shifting borderlands. Indigenous skills for survival developed over centuries through experimentation, creating knowledge that was passed across the generations through quotidian practices, oral traditions, and rituals of dance and song. The colonial borderlands in Petatlan. Spanish colonialism came to the Gureme borderlands in the early 17th century through Jesuit missions and the mining industry. The Society of Jesus founded a network of mission districts extending through the river valleys of Petatlan in the provinces that became known under Spanish administration as Sinaloa, Ostimuri, and Sonora. In mid-century, the frontiers of mission evangelization, advancing northward from the Jesuit College of Sinaloa, met the mining frontier proceeding westward from Nueva Vizcaya, from the mountainous region of what today is Durango and Chihuahua. Mining began in Ostimuri with silver strikes in the 1660s, deep in the Sierra between the Yaqui and Mayo drainages. From the late 17th to the early 18th century, numerous silver mines and gold placers opened throughout the region. The parallel development of missions and reales de minas, or mining centers, created conflicts involving labor and resources. The mines and surrounding settlements became markets for mission produce and livestock, but at the same time, the missions became labor repositories for the mines. Workers were recruited on a rotational basis. They supplied the labor system known as repartimiento. This was obligatory labor, but it was paid labor. It was not chattel slavery. But these were rotational gangs of laborers that were taken from the mission pueblos to the mines and returned. However, parallel to these labor drafts, Indians traveled on their own to the mines incorporating paid labor into their patterns of seasonal migration. Over time, colonists and mission pueblos competed ever more rigorously for indigenous workers and the productive resources of croplands, pasturage, woodlands, and water sources in streams and springs. Jesuit missions were intended to bring scattered indigenous settlements into permanent villages, and they did this to a degree. But in practice, they became an interface between the rancherias, or small villages, that supported the Indians' seasonal movements through different biomes, and the ceremonial and political centers of mission pueblos. As the Spanish population grew, with the expansion of mining and livestock ranching, the institutional status of the missions under colonial law protected indigenous agricultural lands and portions of the monte, where native shepherds and cowhands tended mission herds of cattle. Yet mission lands were not necessarily contiguous or clearly defined, rather separate parcels of croplands, dependent on rainfall or the seasonal flow of intermittent streams, and grasslands mixed with thorn forest, were occupied at different times by both indigenous and Spanish cultivators, pastoralists, and foragers. These irregularly shaped stretches of monte often were named with indigenous toponyms, thus revealing locally recognized histories of occupation and use. And these names often combine the name of a plant and its closeness to a stream or its closeness to a hill. They're very pictorially descriptive of the landscape. Customary land tenure in these borderlands became institutionalized under the pressures of population growth and increased livestock herds. Over the course of the 18th century, colonial authorities pressured Spanish settlers to regularize their occupation of portions of the grasslands, woodlands, and scrub forest through a legal process involving the payment of royal fees to carry out the measurement, public auction, and issuance of title that turned open portions of the monte into discreetly bounded and privately owned properties. And many of the Spanish settlers were simply occupying land. And this process by which the Crown is trying to gain the revenues of imposing fees is what generates the documentation that allows us to reconstruct these changing patterns of land tenure. Private landholdings evolved from use rights, negotiated through verbal agreements, to demarcated and titled properties. The legal processes for enclosing portions of these woodlands contrasted with informal arrangements for sharing pasturage and water or transferring use rights through purchase and inheritance. Formal land ownership with measured boundaries and property markers ran counter to indigenous practices of land use and access based on the seasonal occupation of the monte and the resources of water, forests, and wildlife sheltered within it. The enclosure of the monte bears directly on the production of traditional ecological knowledge and its preservation and continued growth across generations. From the several hundred land titles and judicial disputes recorded in different archives, I have constructed a history of the dual process of land privatization through formal title and the defense of open space and the community institutions for their access and governance by indigenous peoples. To illustrate these processes, I bring to you today just one of these disputes involving the highland communities of Tepawi, Conikarit, and Macoyawi at the headwaters of the Mayo and Cedros rivers. Yeah, and they're actually on the next slide. These villages first entered the written historical record through 16th century expeditions led by Francisco Vázquez de Coronado, whom many people have heard of, in the 1540s, and Francisco de Ibarra in the 1560s. This second expedition left a very detailed chronicle about this region where Ibarra spent more time than did Coronado. Ibarra's chronicler described Tepawi as a memorable place along the mountainous trails leading through the Cedros Valley, passing, quote, beautiful riverbanks and arroyos with groves of cottonwoods, willows, and cedars. During the 17th century, Jesuit letters and reports took note of the Tepawis as having mounted armed resistance to Spanish military entradas, even as some of their leaders requested missionaries. Beginning in 1621, these highland villages consolidated into 3 mission pueblos. Conicare, that was the main village, meaning the crow's nest. Macoyawi, meaning where stone axes are heard, and Tepawi, the place of the fatted deer. We see many deer around here in Chapel Hill. Deer for many Mesoamerican peoples, and for these